So inertia is the reluctance of an object or body to move. For an object to overcome its inertia and move, it must have a force applied to it which is greater than the opposite force that opposes it. If an object has a greater mass, it will have a greater inertial value. So, for example, a basketball will only move if a force is applied to it. This could be a player pushing it in a pass. Comparing it to getting a bowling ball moved, the bowling ball would require a much greater force for it to overcome its inertia compared to the basketball. There are 3 types of motion. The first type of motion is linear motion. This is movement in a straight line, which is created by direct force. So, for example, a basketballer giving a chest pass, which was powered by an equally applied force to both sides of the ball. It will travel in a straight line. The second type of motion is angular motion. So this is movement around an axis, and it is created by an eccentric force, which is an uneven force causing motion. For example, a basketball being shot into a net will have a backspin, which is an angular motion because the ball is rotating around an imaginary axis in the ball. The third type of motion is general motion. This is a combination of both linear and angular motion in one movement. So an example of this will be a basketballer running as their arms and legs would be moving angularly, having an axis around the ball and socket joints in the limbs, but their body will be travelling in a straight line in one direction all at the same time. There are 3 laws of motion which Newton devised. So his first law is the law of inertia. As I mentioned before, inertia is the body's reluctance to move or change motion or start to move, which explains that a body will not move or change velocity unless an external force causes it to. This also relates to it slowing down and stopping. So in relation to this external force, it will need to be greater than the force which opposes it in the opposite direction. Otherwise, the forces will be balanced and it will remain unchanged in its position. So an example of this would be that in basketball, if the ball is rolling along the ground, it wouldn't start to roll unless an external force caused it to be. So that force could be someone pushing it, and that would generate a force greater than the force in the opposite direction, which causes it to be still, so it will just move. This could be someone kicking or pushing it in a match. The ball wouldn't stop unless an external force causes it to, so this could be it hit a wall and the velocity changes because it goes in the opposite direction. Newton's second law is the law of acceleration. This states that a body or object will not change speed if a greater force is applied to that acting in the opposite direction. Oh wait, it will change speed, not it won't. The law of acceleration relates to the mass of an object. For example, an object with a larger mass will require a greater force to be applied to make it accelerate. So an example of this in basketball will be that a force is created when pushing off the floor to jump. The reaction force that the player generates will be greater than the weight that pushes them down, making them stand on the floor. So therefore they will accelerate in an upwards direction, and this force will have to be greater if it's a heavier person. Newton's third law states that for every force or action there is a force of reaction or an opposing force to it. So an example in basketball is that a player passes the ball by applying a force, and so the ball will react with a reactant force which allows it to be passed to another player. This can also be explained by a sprinter pushing off starting blocks, because as they push off the blocks will create an opposing force due to them being nailed to the ground and them not being able to move anywhere, so the sprinter will be able to push off them. There are 2 types of forces, so this is direct force and eccentric force. I mentioned them earlier. Direct force is when a force is applied directly through a centre of mass or equally applied on both sides of an object. So a direct force will create linear motion. An example of this in basketball is giving a chest pass where the force is evenly applied on both sides of the ball, and it will travel in a straight line linearly and won't spin. And it's also seen in a knuckleball in football when the footballer kicks it right in the middle of the ball. Eccentric force is when a force is applied outside of the centre of mass of the object, and therefore it will create angular motion and rotation. So an example of this in basketball would be flicking at the end of the shot to create a backspin, which allows the ball to roll into the net, and it's an eccentric force that has been applied which allows this to happen. Impulse is a change in momentum of an object which a force is acted upon. It's calculated by the amount of force the object is under multiplied the time it's been under the force for. So an example of this is a basketball would have an impulse of 8 newtons per second if it was rolled along the floor for 2 seconds at a force of 4 newtons. Momentum is the amount of motion passed by a moving object. Therefore, it's a combination of mass and velocity. Velocity is the larger factor in changing an object's momentum because an object is less likely to change its mass. So, for example, a basketball's momentum will change due to velocity changing because there aren't many factors in a game which would change the basketball's mass. So, therefore, it can't really affect the momentum. Stability is the ability of an object to remain or resist any changes to its position. It can be affected by the object's centre of mass, base of support, and line of gravity. In sports, stability is important because it prevents an athlete from falling over or being pushed over. For example, if a basketballer was stable when an attacker drove into him, he would be able to hold his ground and remain in an upright position. Instability is when the performer is unstable in their position. So, for example, a basketballer going into their tippy toes to become taller when defending a shot, they'll be unstable because something will easily be able to change their position. And for some sporting performers, though, it's important to make themselves unstable in order to do their sport. So, for example, diving, because they need to be able to fall off the board to do their tricks. Stability is affected by mass and weight. So mass is the amount of matter in a volume and it's a scalar. It is measured in kilograms. The more mass an object has is essentially the more stable it will be because it takes more force to be used to make it unstable. So an example would be a basketballer that has a mass of 100 kilograms will be harder to topple over than a basketballer who is 78 kilograms. Weight is a body or object's quantity or the amount of matter contained by it. It acts in a downwards direction and is therefore measured in newtons. It's a vector quantity as it gives an indication of magnitude and direction. The more weight that an object or body has is essentially the more stable they'll be. For example, a basketballer has a weight of 78 newtons will be easier to topple over than a basketballer of 100 newtons because the gravity is acting on them and the force that is pulling them down is larger. So it's a vector because newtons means that it's going towards the ground, whereas if it was a negative value, it would mean it would be moving up. So stability is also affected by the centre of mass and its location. So centre of mass is the point at which the body or object is balanced in all directions. It can sometimes be outside the body for a performer, which is seen in the Fosbury swap, which is the picture here, which is a high jumping technique because the jumper bends their body over in order to get over the bar, and in doing this, they shift their centre of mass outside their body. The line of gravity will extend from the centre of mass to the floor, which is the point at which the mass of the body acts. So the base of support is the width of a body or object created by the points of contact with the floor. An example of this is if a basketballer was standing with their legs a metre apart, their base of support would be a metre. With a wider base of support, the object will be more stable. For example, when an attacking basketballer is driving towards a defender, the defender will widen their legs to prepare for the impact because they'll be more stable. It will also affect the stability of a performer if the base of support was in the plane of movement that was being used. So there's 3 planes of movement: the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. An example of the sagittal plane is when it splits the performer vertically down the middle, dividing the sides of the body. So movement in the sagittal plane would be sprinting motion, where the basketballer is moving their arms and legs. The frontal plane splits the body in half vertically, so front and back, and the transverse plane splits the body in half vertically but divides the body like top, head and bottom. So an example of a movement in the transverse plane would be someone falling over. Well, not falling over, like bending over. The points of contact is the amount of points touching the floor. So the more points of contact with the floor will mean the performer is more stable. So for example, being on all fours is more stable than standing on 2 feet. To maximise stability in all planes of movement, the body will need more points of contact with the floor. However, it is dependent at the size of the base of support, because if all contact points are closer together, then the performer will still be unstable. The line of gravity is an invisible vertical line running down from the centre of mass to the floor. If the line of gravity falls within the base of support, the object or body will be more stable as the base of support is holding the weight. The body or object will be more stable if their line of gravity is shorter, because it means their centre of mass is close to the floor. So if a basketballer was doing a box out, then they would bend their legs lower, that their centre of mass would shift towards the floor, which would shorten their centre of gravity, and they'll be more stable in their position. Factors that lead to increasing stability of a performer include the centre of mass being closer to the ground. For example, a basketballer will lower themselves in a crouching position if an attacker starts running at them, because they'll be closer to the ground and their centre of mass will be lowered. The base of support will increase stability if it's made wider. For example, the same basketballer will open their legs slightly in order to create a border brace and be more stable. The points of contact with the floor increase stability because the more points touching the floor means there are more points which the weight can be distributed over. And by having a base of support in the same plane of motion, as it creates stability in the direction the body limbs are being moved, and therefore the performer will be more stable. So an example of this is a defending basketballer will have both feet on the floor when an attacker drives at him, as he can evenly distribute his weight from 2 feet. The line of gravity will increase stability if it is shorter. This is because the centre of mass is closer to the ground. So for example, when the basketballer lowers himself towards the ground, he'll be shortening his line of gravity and therefore making him more stable. The mass and weight of an object will make it more stable, because if the basketballer is heavier and has a greater mass and weight, then it will be harder and require more force to push him over and change his position. The factors which reduce stability are the same, but working in the opposite way. So the centre of mass, to reduce stability, it will be outside of the body and moved high above the ground. So for example, after scoring a goal, the basketballer will move their centre of mass outside his body as he forces his body to rotate in a flip. The base of support will reduce stability if it's narrowed, because there is less distance for the weight to be distributed. For example, before the basketballer flips, will stand with feet closer together before pushing off, making them less stable and easily change their position. Stability will also be reduced with an amount of points of contact with the floor. So for example, the basketballer will create instability when he pushed off the floor, and therefore there will be no points of contact with the floor to support his weight. The line of gravity can create instability if it's lengthened and initiated outside the body. This is because it means that the centre of mass is higher and the outside of the body leads to instability. So for example, when the basketballer jumps up, his centre of mass will lengthen to above the ground and will shift outside of his body as he rotates around it. The mass and weight of an object or body can reduce stability if it's lighter, because less force is needed for it to change its position, as there's a less gravitational pull on the object, because there's less mass.